a fictional script. All characters, institutions, and events depicted below are entirely invented for dramatic purposes and do not represent real people or real occurrences. The Velvet Sofa Show has seen 22 years of Friday nights, hangovers confessed on air, marriage proposals gone sideways, a boy band reunion that ended in tears, a magician who set a prop on fire by accident. The Velvet Sofa itself has been reupholstered 4 times, mostly because guests keep spilling wine on it during the parts where they finally tell the truth. But nobody in that studio, not the crew, not the warm-up comedian, not host Ronnie Ashford himself, was prepared for the night Dame Eleanor Vos sat down across from Prince Alaric of Belmore. By the time the credits rolled, a man who had spent 3 years building a career out of grievance had run out of things to say. Not because anyone shouted him down, not because a tabloid ambushed him, because an 81-year-old actress with 2 Academy Awards and absolutely nothing left to prove had simply decided to ask him questions he couldn't answer. The audience didn't make a sound for nearly 7 minutes. The clip that followed was watched 40 million times before the weekend was over. People started calling it The Reckoning, and for once the nickname wasn't an exaggeration. Understand first what this show is not. The Velvet Sofa Show is not Newsnight. It's not a tribunal. It is Friday night television, a glass of wine, a warm host, low stakes, easy laughs. Ronnie Ashford has built an entire career on diffusing tension before it curdles into something real. This was the one night he couldn't. Dame Eleanor Vos had been booked to discuss her involvement in a new television film marking the centenary of the fictional monarch Queen Adelaide III of Belmore, a role Eleanor had played 20 years earlier, the performance that won her first Oscar, and a subject she had spent decades researching long after the cameras stopped rolling. She didn't arrive that night as a monarchist, a royalist commentator, or an apologist for anyone. She arrived as a craftswoman who had spent half her life trying to understand one woman's sense of duty, and who had opinions about people who talked about duty without ever having practiced it. Prince Alaric arrived separately, and later. Alaric, the younger son of Belmore's reigning monarch, had spent the previous 3 years becoming a fixture of a very particular kind of fame, the kind built less on accomplishment than on disclosure. A streaming documentary about his departure from royal life, a memoir ghostwritten but unmistakably his in tone, titled Unspoken, which detailed private arguments with his brother, his father's medical history, and a string of family confrontations that had previously stayed behind closed doors. A podcast where he discussed his estrangement from the family in increasingly granular detail. He had, by any measure, monetized his unhappiness with remarkable efficiency. 2 other guests sat on the sofa that night, a stand-up comedian promoting a tour, and a folk singer with a new record. History, such as it is, has not been kind to their airtime. From the moment Eleanor and Alaric exchanged their first look across the studio, every other person in that room became a witness rather than a participant. Ronnie opened with a joke about the weather. Nobody laughed particularly hard. Something about the air already felt different, though nobody could have said exactly why. Ronnie turned to Eleanor first, as planned. What had drawn her back to Queen Adelaide after 20 years? Her answer was measured, almost gentle. Adelaide would have turned 100 this year, Eleanor said, 70 of those years spent by her own choice, in near total service to an institution she didn't always agree with. What I came to understand, over years of study, Eleanor said, is that duty isn't a burden for everyone who carries it. For some people, it becomes identity. Adelaide woke up every day of her adult life understanding that her preferences came second, not because someone forced that on her, because she believed something larger than her own comfort mattered. Across the sofa, Alaric shifted. Ronnie, sensing the air had changed, turned to him something light, something about childhood memories of his grandmother, the old queen, Adelaide's own mother. Alaric, to his credit, started warmly. He talked about her humor, her habit of sneaking him sweets before dinner, her steadiness during a difficult period in his adolescence, and then, almost as an afterthought, He added something he perhaps shouldn't have. He said he hoped people would also remember that institutions like the Belmore Crown could make the people inside them feel trapped. That service, viewed from the inside, looked nothing like it looked from a documentary crew's cameras. Eleanor turned toward him, unhurried. Could it? She said. I've spent 20 years studying that institution from the outside, reading, interviewing people who lived inside it, trying to understand its actual weight, not the version that makes good television. You studied it, Alaric said. I lived it. For how long? 2 words. That was the whole sentence. No heat in it, no theatrics, just delivered the way you'd ask someone the time. But the studio felt it land. Because Eleanor hadn't attacked him, she'd simply asked him to measure the scope of his own claim against the size of the authority he was assuming it gave him. Alaric said he'd been inside the family his entire life. Eleanor nodded slowly. You grew up inside it. You spent most of your adult life trying to get out of it. Those aren't the same experience. Adelaide spent her whole life trying to stay faithful to it. There's a difference between occupying a role and devoting yourself to one. The comedian laughed, nervously, alone. Here the conversation shifted from uncomfortable to something closer to historic. Ronnie tried, gamely, to pivot back toward the film, a specific scene, a lighter question about costume fittings. Eleanor declined the pivot, politely but unmistakably. Before we move on, she said, I'd like to ask Alaric something directly, if that's allowed. Ronnie glanced at his cue cards, then at Alaric, then back at Eleanor. Go ahead. Eleanor turned to face him fully. The institution you describe as damaging gave you a title, a global platform, access to rooms and resources most people spend entire careers trying to reach. How do you reconcile criticizing something you still visibly benefit from? Alaric said he'd built his own platform since leaving. Have you? Just those 2 words again, that same quiet, patient precision. The documentary deal, the memoir advance, the speaking fees, the podcast sponsorships, every door that had opened for him since walking away, would any of them have opened for a man named Alaric with no royal surname attached? Strip the title away entirely. Strip away the palace, the crest, the accident of birth that made his name recognizable before he'd done a single thing to earn recognition. What was left that he had built independently? The studio went completely still. Alaric said his advocacy work, he'd become a vocal supporter of mental health awareness campaigns, stood on its own merits. Does it? Eleanor asked. Or does it have the audience it has because you're the son of a king? The silence that followed wasn't a comfortable pause. It was the silence of a room full of people who already knew the answer and were waiting to see if anyone would say it out loud. Most hosts, most guests in polite public life would have let that silence stand as its own conclusion and moved gently toward something lighter. Eleanor Voss did not move toward anything lighter. She continued, quietly, with the unhurried patience of someone who had clearly prepared for this conversation long before she sat down. She raised the Alaric Foundation, his charitable organization, the one he consistently pointed to as evidence of independent purpose. I looked into it, Eleanor said. Lovely website, inspiring language. But when I searched for outcomes, actual, specific, measurable outcomes, I found remarkably little. What has the foundation actually produced? Alaric said it was still growing, still finding its footing. After 3 years, Eleanor said, your father's Belmore Youth Trust has placed over 100,000 young people into apprenticeships, built from nothing, over 4 decades. That's not a fair comparison, Alaric said. You can't measure a new foundation against one that old. Then don't invoke the family legacy when it's convenient for you, Eleanor replied, and reject the comparison the moment it isn't. You can't borrow the weight of an institution to make yourself more interesting and then refuse to be measured by that same institution's standards. It wasn't a cruel observation. It was, if anything, a simple demand for consistency. And Alaric's response to it was the moment that made the studio audibly gasp. He said, with visible irritation, that he wasn't going to be lectured by someone who played dress-up as my grandmother for a film. Eleanor's answer came without a single raised note. An actress who spent 20 years understanding the woman you're describing so casually, who studied your family's actual history more carefully, it seems, than you have. An actress who earned her title through 50 years of documented work, not through the accident of being born into the right bed. The sound the audience made wasn't quite applause. It wasn't quite a gasp either. It was something in between the involuntary noise of people watching something land. Eleanor wasn't finished. She raised the matter of family gatherings Alaric had stopped attending, reported estrangements, cousins and aunts who, by multiple accounts, found it increasingly difficult to stay close to someone whose private conversations kept turning up in best-selling books. How does it feel, she asked, to have sold your family's private words for a publishing advance? How would you feel if someone did that to you? Eleanor didn't reach for an argument. She reached for a principle. Privacy isn't something you get to claim selectively. You've demanded it loudly for yourself while removing it from your father, your brother, your grandmother, even after her death. That's not truth-telling. That's commerce. Commerce. The word landed a second time, deliberately, like a nail being set. The press treats everyone in your family badly, she continued. That part isn't unique to you. What's unique is what you did with it. The documentary wasn't charity. The memoir wasn't therapy you happened to publish. It earned millions. You've monetized your grievances more successfully than anyone in the history of that family, and calling that speaking your truth doesn't change what it actually is. Into the silence that followed, Alaric said quietly, "I just wanted to protect my family." Eleanor paused, and when she spoke again, there was something almost sad in her voice. Protecting your family doesn't require a streaming deal. It doesn't require a 400-page book. Protection and publication aren't the same act. If protection was really what you wanted, you could have had it in silence. By now, Ronnie had long since given up steering the conversation. He sat with his cards untouched, wearing the particular expression of someone watching a controlled demolition from what he hoped was a safe distance. Eleanor asked to continue. "One more thing, and I ask this not to be unkind, but because I think it's the real question underneath all the others. Do you believe you're actually wanted? Not by an audience, by your family, by the country you came from. Not your content, not the story you generate. Who wants you present in their life? Who misses you when you're not there?" The silence that followed was the longest of the night. Alaric said his wife wanted him, his children. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I believe that. But is a spouse's love the same as being wanted by a community, by the country that raised you? I won't speculate about your marriage, but those are different kinds of wanting." Alaric said he had millions of followers who supported him. "That's not the same as being wanted," Eleanor said. "That's being watched. People watch car accidents too. Being wanted means being missed. When you don't show up somewhere, who actually feels the gap?" The answer he gave was halting, unfinished, and the gap in it, the place where a confident answer should have lived, said more than any sentence could have. Then came the exchange that closed the conversation for good. Alaric said, with visible frustration, that it was difficult to take criticism from someone who had profited off playing a member of my family. Eleanor smiled, not with triumph, with something closer to pity. "I played your grandmother because I respected her enough to spend years trying to understand her, because I believed she was worth the effort. What I see in you is someone who was given everything: a title, a platform, protection, access most people will never touch, and has spent 3 years calculating how to convert, leaving all of it into income. That's not courage. That's strategy. And it's worked financially, but it hasn't bought you the thing you actually want. And the thing you actually want can't be bought with a streaming contract." Alaric stood, straightened his jacket. "I didn't come here to be attacked," he said. Eleanor looked at him with the same steady calm she'd carried the entire evening. "You came to discuss your work. I discussed your work. What I offered wasn't an attack. It was an examination. The difference is whether the questions have answers. An attack doesn't need any. An examination does. You didn't have them." He left. The studio door closed behind him, and the sofa sat in the particular silence of a room that had just witnessed something nobody quite had the words for yet. Ronnie looked at his cards, then at the remaining guests, then at the audience. Eleanor smoothed her sleeve. The stillness she carried wasn't performed, it was accumulated. The kind that only comes from 50 years of difficult rooms and difficult questions. This wasn't the hardest room she'd ever sat in. It just happened to be filmed. She asked to say one more thing, directly to the camera. Ronnie nodded. Nobody in that studio was going to stop her. I was raised by parents who thought the whole idea of monarchy was faintly ridiculous, she said. They'd have been uncomfortable with most of what I've spent my career doing. But studying Adelaide, genuinely trying to understand her instead of simply judging her, taught me something about duty I hadn't expected to learn. The discipline of putting something larger than yourself ahead of your own comfort, day after day, without asking for credit for it. What I watched tonight was the opposite of that. Someone who was given extraordinary things by an institution, recognition, security, a name that opens doors, and has spent years cataloging how badly those gifts were wrapped. That isn't honesty. And somebody who's earned the right to say so needed to say it. The applause that followed came slowly, not the quick burst of an entertainment show. The heavier, considered applause of an audience that had just been through something and was only beginning to understand what it was. The folk singer, silent all evening, said quietly, "My gran used to watch every royal broadcast at Christmas. She'd have been glad someone finally said that." "That's who I was thinking of," Eleanor said. The network aired the footage that night without a single cut. By morning, the clip had spread far past Belmore's borders. Strip away the royal connection, and what's left became the line everyone quoted, alongside protection and publication aren't the same act, and the line about commerce. Alaric's team released a statement calling the appearance a coordinated ambush. Eleanor's team released 3 sentences in response. Coordinated? I spoke from years of study and honest observation. What he's calling an ambush was an 81-year-old woman asking questions he couldn't answer. And one line more, which spread as widely as anything from the broadcast itself. I've played a queen. I've studied a queen. When someone attacks that legacy while still living off it, I notice. And at 81, I have nothing left to lose by noticing out loud. That's the whole explanation, really, for why Eleanor Vos could do what no journalist, no palace correspondent, no relative had managed in 3 years of trying. She had no brand left to protect beyond the one she'd spent 5 decades building through the work itself. No algorithm to please, no deal to safeguard, no borrowed platform she needed anyone's permission to keep. Just a body of work, a title she'd earned the hard way, and the particular freedom of a person who has already proven what she needed to prove, and doesn't need anyone's approval to say something true out loud. So what did that velvet sofa reveal? Really, on a Friday night, nobody in Belmore television will forget. It showed the difference between earned authority and assumed authority, between a name that means something because of 50 years of demonstrated work and a name that means something because of an accident of birth, between someone who studied an institution because she respected it enough to try to understand it, and someone who briefly lived inside that institution and left with it repackaged as content. Eleanor asked what Alaric had built independently. He couldn't answer. She asked if he was actually wanted by anyone, anywhere, beyond an audience that watched him the way people watch a car accident. He couldn't answer. She asked what protection required that publication could provide. He couldn't answer. And in each of those silences, not cruel silences, not manufactured for television, just the plain absence of an answer to a fair question, the contrast between the two people on that sofa became impossible to look away from. Not because Eleanor was unkind. She wasn't, not once, across the entire evening. She never raised her voice, never reached for a personal insult, never stepped outside the specific, documented public territory of things Alaric had actually said and done. Every question she asked was one that had an answer, if the answer existed. Some people spend their whole lives earning the right to be believed. They take the unglamorous roles, put in the years nobody's watching, study the things they don't yet understand because they think understanding is worth the effort, and build something real slowly, 1 decade at a time. The authority that comes out the other end of that, the kind that lets an 81-year-old woman sit perfectly still while a prince walks off a set, can't be bought, inherited, or manufactured overnight. Eleanor Vos earned every word she said on that sofa. The silence that followed her said the rest.